The morning comes in quietly. It will not stay that way. September the 7th, 1876, Northfield, Minnesota. A Thursday. The air carries the first coolness of early autumn, and the town moves through its ordinary rhythms. Merchants open up their shutters. A wagon rolls across the bridge on Division Street. The Cannon River moves below it, dark and indifferent. A young man home from university is standing near the entrance of a hardware store when the riders come in. He has been back for the summer, reading medicine, carrying the careful habits of someone learning to observe. He notices things. The books are teaching him that. He notices the horses first. There are too many of them. They come in from the south end of Division Street in loose clusters, not together, but not entirely separate either. Some of the men wear long linen dusters, the kind that button down the front and cover what a man might otherwise prefer not to show. They ride with a particular quality of stillness, not the stillness of men at rest, the stillness of men waiting. The student watches from the doorway. Two men dismount near the corner of Division and 4th, and they move without hurry, but their eyes move constantly. A third man stays mounted in the street. Others hold back further along the block. One of them says something to the man beside him without looking at him. Then, 3 men enter the First National Bank. It's not yet 9:30 in the morning. The student does not move immediately. He watches the men in the street. He watches the way they position themselves. He has no certain knowledge of what's happening inside that building, but he has enough. The way the mounted men have angled their horses facing outward. The way the one on the corner keeps his hand near his coat. The way nothing about this looks like ordinary business. He goes inside the hardware store. He finds the rifles. He takes 2. He carries them to the door and passes one to a merchant who has come out onto the street. He passes another to whoever will take it. A few men arm themselves from whatever is available. There is no coordination, no command, just men reading the same street and arriving at the same conclusion. The student grabs his own rifle and hurries across to the hotel on the opposite side of Division Street. He takes the stairs. He reaches the upper floor and moves to a window overlooking the street below. He can see the bank entrance. He can see the riders positioned along the block. He can see a town that does not yet fully understand what is unfolding inside one of its buildings. He rests the rifle on the sill. Below him, the street has begun to shift. A man runs. A shout carries but is unclear. One of the mounted riders has drawn a revolver. The men near the bank entrance are watching the street with something that has moved past calculation and into urgency. The student loads a round. He sights down the barrel and he pulls the trigger. This is the story of what a small town in Minnesota revealed about a myth that had grown too large for the man inside of it. About a war that ended on paper, but not in the men that it made. They had become a question, about the war itself, about the South, about what America owed the men it had broken. So what happens when a legend rides into the wrong town? What becomes of a man shaped too long by war? And how far can a myth carry a man before the weight of it begins to break him? You're listening to The Crow's Tales, and this is the story of Jesse James and the Northfield Bank Heist. Missouri in the 1850s was not a state at war, but it was a state preparing for one. The tensions that would eventually tear the country apart were older and deeper in Missouri than in most places. It was a slave state that shared a long border with Kansas, a territory convulsing through the question of whether slavery would spread westward. The violence along that border was not metaphorical. Raids, reprisals, burned homesteads, men killed in fields and on doorsteps. The formal war had not yet begun, but the killing had. Jesse Woodson James was born on September the 5th, 1847, in Clay County, Missouri. His father, Robert James, was a Baptist minister who left for the California goldfields when Jesse was 3 years old and died there shortly after. His mother, Zerelda, was a formidable woman who remarried twice and raised her children on a farm worked partly by enslaved people. It was a household shaped by loss, by hard labour, and by the particular pride of a family that considered itself respectable in a community where respectability was tightly bound to the Confederate cause. Jesse was 13 when the war began. He was 16 when he entered it. By then, the formal armies had already swept through Missouri more than once. But the war that mattered most in Clay County was not the one fought in lines and formations. It was fought in the brush, along creek beds and tree lines, in the hours before dawn. It was guerrilla warfare, and it had its own logic, its own code, and its own brutality. The irregulars, who called themselves bushwhackers, operated outside the recognised rules of military engagement. They did not wear uniforms in any consistent way. They did not take prisoners reliably. They moved quickly, struck hard, and disappeared back into the landscape. Their opponents, the Unionist militias and jayhawkers from Kansas, operated with a similar ruthlessness. Farms were burned, families threatened, men were executed without trial. Jesse's older brother Frank had joined Quantrill's raiders in 1862. William Quantrill led the most feared of the Confederate guerrilla bands, men who became notorious not only for their effectiveness, but for their savagery. In August 1863, Quantrill led approximately 450 raiders into Lawrence, Kansas, a town identified as a centre of abolitionist sentiment. They killed roughly 150 men and boys. They burned much of the town to the ground. It was one of the worst atrocities in the entire war. Jesse was 15 when Lawrence burned. He was watching what the war was making of the men around him. In 1864, at 16 years of age, he joined a guerrilla band led by Bloody Bill Anderson, a man whose violence had gone beyond military purpose into something closer to ritual. Anderson's men rode into battle with scalps hanging from their saddles. They killed Union soldiers and civilians with equal indifference. Jesse rode with them through that brutal summer and autumn, learning that survival required a particular kind of detachment, that hesitation was more dangerous than action, that the rules applied to other people. The war ended in the spring of 1865. For most men, that meant something. For the guerrillas of Missouri, it was more complicated. They were not covered cleanly by the terms of surrender. Some were hunted, some were killed while trying to surrender. Jesse himself was shot through the chest by Union soldiers as he rode under a flag of truce near Lexington, Missouri. He survived, barely. Nursed back to health by his family, he never entirely forgave the circumstances of that wound. The men who returned from the Brush War returned to a Missouri that had shifted beneath them. The Confederacy was finished, slavery was finished. The political order they had fought to preserve was gone. Many of the men who had been their neighbours and supporters were now suspected, surveilled, or impoverished. Former guerrillas could not vote, they could not hold office, and in some cases could not testify in court. The society they had ridden for had no place for them. Jesse James was 18 years old, still recovering from a near-fatal wound, and the world he had been raised to expect no longer existed. What came next wasn't inevitable, but it was not surprising. In February 1866, a group of armed men rode into Liberty, Missouri, and robbed the Clay County Savings Bank. It was the first daylight bank robbery of a peacetime financial institution in American history. 2 men were killed. The robbers rode away with close to $60,000, roughly equivalent to $1.2 million today. Frank James was likely among them. Jesse was almost certainly not, still too weakened from his wound. But the template was established. Over the following years, Jesse joined what would become known as the James Younger Gang, a loose confederation of former guerrillas who applied the skills of irregular warfare to robbery. They moved fast. They hit targets without warning. They were comfortable with violence in a way that conventional law enforcement struggled to match. Between 1866 and 1876, they robbed banks, stagecoaches, and trains across Missouri, Kentucky, Iowa, and beyond. The methods were familiar to anyone who had ridden in the Brush War. Strike quickly, create confusion, exploit the gap between decision and response. A town that took 10 minutes to organise a posse was a town they were already 20 miles clear of. They understood terrain, they understood fear, and they understood that most people, when confronted with armed men moving with purpose, will step aside rather than intervene. Not everyone stepped aside. There were robberies that went wrong, witnesses who resisted, lawmen who gave chase longer than expected. Men were killed who did not need to be killed. The gang was not surgical, it was ruthless, and the line between those two things blurred further with each passing year. But the law could not catch them, and in the absence of capture, the story of Jesse James had room to grow into something the facts alone could not have produced. What made them unusual was not simply their success, it was the story that grew around them. In the years after the war, Missouri's political landscape remained deeply divided. The men who had supported the Confederacy felt themselves dispossessed and resentful. Into that resentment came newspaper editors, most notably John Newman Edwards of the Kansas City Times, who fashioned Jesse James into something the newspapers could sell. A Robin Hood of the former Confederacy. A man striking back against the banks and railroads that were squeezing the small farmer. A son of the South refusing to surrender. Edwards was not simply reporting, he was constructing. Many of the stories attributed to Jesse's gallantry were fabricated or embellished. A robbery would be reported as an act of redistribution. A killing would be reframed as an act of self-defense or omitted entirely. The gang's victims, often small depositors and working travelers rather than the more powerful institutions the legend described, did not fit the story Edwards was selling, and so they were quietly left out of it. Letters attributed to Jesse appeared in the newspapers, articulate and defiant, positioning him as a political actor rather than a criminal. Whether Jesse wrote them himself, collaborated on them, or simply benefited from them, the effect was the same. He had a voice in the national conversation. He was arguing his own case in print while the law was still trying to find him in person. The reading public of the 1870s was hungry for this. The frontier was still alive in the imagination, even as it contracted in reality. The war had been over for a decade, but its grievances had not yet been resolved. A man who refused to accept the verdict of Appomattox, who kept riding and kept stealing and kept sending letters to the newspapers, filled something in the culture that respectable society could not openly acknowledge wanting. Jesse understood this, at least intuitively. He was not an educated man in any formal sense, but he was shrewd, and he knew the value of the image that was being built around him. He cultivated it where he could. He was also, by the mid-1870s, beginning to live inside it in ways that were becoming dangerous. He became a figure, not just a man. The Pinkerton National Detective Agency had been tracking the gang for years, hired by the railroads whose trains were being robbed. The Pinkertons were efficient and ruthless, but the terrain of western Missouri worked against them. The James family had deep community ties. Information moved slowly outward from Clay County and quickly inward. Several Pinkerton operatives were killed while attempting to infiltrate the gang's network. In January 1875, the agency made a catastrophic error. Acting on intelligence that Jesse and his brother Frank were at their mother's farm, a group of Pinkerton agents surrounded the house in the early hours of the morning. They threw an incendiary device through the window of the James family home, intending to flush out whoever was inside. Jesse and Frank were not there. The device landed near the fireplace. The explosion tore off Zerelda's right forearm and killed Jesse's 8-year-old half-brother, Archie, who had been asleep nearby. The backlash was immediate and severe. Even people who had no sympathy for the gang's crimes recoiled at the image of a mother maimed and a child killed in a midnight raid on a farmhouse. The Pinkertons had gone to a family home in the middle of the night and killed a boy. Whatever the James brothers were, this was something else. Missouri newspapers, national newspapers, and even some members of Congress condemned the agency. A bill was then introduced in Missouri to offer the James brothers amnesty. It failed, but narrowly, and the fact that it came close at all said something about the mood of the state. Public sympathy, already cultivated by years of newspaper myth-making, hardened into something more visceral. The raid on the family farm was not an abstraction. It was a dead child in a woman's arm. It gave people who had been passively sympathetic a reason to feel actively wronged on Jesse's behalf. And it gave Jesse something he'd always understood the value of but had never possessed so completely before. He was now not merely an outlaw, he was a man wronged. But beneath the mythology, the pressure was building. The gang's composition had changed over the years. Some members were dead, some had drifted away, others were unreliable. The railroads were increasing their cooperation with law enforcement. The territory in which the gang could move freely was contracting. And Jesse himself had changed. The controlled violence of his guerrilla years had curdled into something less disciplined. There were moments of cruelty that served no tactical purpose, a witness killed unnecessarily, a robbery botched through overconfidence. The paranoia was deepening too. Jesse had always been watchful, but watchfulness had become something closer to suspicion of everyone and everything. He changed lodgings frequently. He used multiple aliases. He limited what he told any single member of the gang about his movements or his plans. He had seen enough men caught to know that information travelled, and that men sitting across from you at supper might be the one who gave you up for a reward or a reduced sentence. This was not an unfounded fear. The Pinkertons were still out there. The railroads were offering money. Informants existed in the communities that had once sheltered the gang without question. The web of loyalty and silence that had protected them through the late 1860s and the early 1870s was fraying at its edges, slowly but unmistakably. He needed distance. He needed a place where no one knew his face and no one was watching for him. By 1876, Jesse was 29 years old. He had been living outside the law for a decade. He had a wife, Zerelda Mims, his first cousin, who shared her given name with his mother by coincidence, and 2 young children. He moved frequently, living under assumed names in rented houses in Tennessee and elsewhere, always watchful, always aware that the life he was living had a finite horizon. The decision to ride north to Minnesota was driven by several things at once. Cole Younger had heard from a contact that the First National Bank of Northfield was flush with money, connected to former Union General Benjamin Butler and the former governor of the state. For men who had spent their adult lives framing their crimes as a constitution of the war, robbing a bank tied to powerful northern interests carried a particular appeal. There was also the simpler matter of pressure. Missouri had become too dangerous. Too many people knew their faces. Too many lawmen had been sharpened by years of close pursuit. Minnesota was distant. It was unfamiliar territory, which was a risk, but it was also a place where no one would be watching for them. A large party assembled, 8 in total, including Jesse and Frank James and several of the younger brothers. They rode into Minnesota in late August 1876, scouting the region, testing the roads, and watching the town. They had done this before. They had ridden into places where no one knew them and ridden out richer. They had no reason to believe Northfield would be different. Pride and habit had carried them a long way. Now those same qualities carried them north, toward a town that was already watching. They came into Minnesota as strangers, which was the point. The 8 men rode in separately and in small groups, spreading across the southern part of the state through the last days of August and into the first week of September 1876. They used false names. They dressed without the markings of their trade. They stopped at farmhouses and small hotels, paid for food and lodging without incident, and asked the kinds of questions that might belong to any traveller passing through unfamiliar country. But unfamiliar country cuts both ways. Missouri had shaped them. They understood its roads, its loyalties, its silences. They knew which men could be trusted and which could not, which towns had long memories and which preferred to look away. Minnesota offered none of that. Every face was unknown. Every landscape was new. They were reading a map they had never seen before, and they were reading it quickly. Cole Younger led much of the advance reconnaissance. He was 32 years old, a large and confident man who had ridden with Quantrill and survived the same irregular war that had formed Jesse. He had been the one to suggest Minnesota in the first place, persuaded by the reports of the bank's holdings and its connection to powerful northern men. He moved through the countryside with the assurance of someone who had never yet found a reason to doubt his own judgment. The gang scouted several towns before settling on Northfield. Mankato was considered and rejected. The streets were too wide, the sight lines too open, the layout unfamiliar in ways that made the calculations difficult. Medili was noted as a waypoint on a potential escape route. The roads between towns were assessed with care. The landscape was flat and open in ways that Missouri was not, offering few natural places to disappear. This should have given them pause. It did not give them enough. What the gang saw when they looked at Northfield was a prosperous town of roughly 2,000 people, built along the Canyon River at the point where two railroads intersected. It had flour mills and a college. It had churches and a main street of solid brick buildings that spoke to a community with money and permanence. The First National Bank sat on Division Street, the town's main thoroughfare, a few steps from the bridge. It looked, on the surface, like exactly the kind of target they had been riding toward for a decade. They ate at local restaurants, they drank at local bars, they asked about the bank in the careful, indirect way of men who had done this before. A few of them rode past the building more than once, clocking the entrance, the street width, the distance to the bridge and the roads beyond it. What they did not do was look closely enough at the people. The town had something else the gang did not fully account for. Many of its men were veterans. The war had ended 11 years before, but its veterans were still in their 30s and 40s, still carrying the practical knowledge of men who had served in real conflict. They were not professional lawmen. They were merchants and farmers and mill workers, but they had loaded rifles under fire, they had held positions, they had learned not to freeze. In the days before the robbery, several townspeople noticed the strangers. A group of men in dusters, lingering longer than travellers usually lingered, asking questions about the bank, moving with a deliberateness that sat uneasily against their apparent leisure. They were polite enough when spoken to. They paid for what they ordered and caused no visible trouble, but something about them sat wrong. Their eyes moved too much. The conversation stopped too quickly when someone approached. A few words were exchanged between locals. A hardware merchant mentioned it to a neighbour. A hotel keeper took note of the names in his register and thought about them afterwards. None of it rose to the level of a warning. No one sent for a lawman. Small towns in 1876 did not call for help on the basis of a feeling. But the feeling was there, spreading quietly from person to person along Division Street. A low and wordless unease that had not entirely dissipated by the morning of September the 7th. The gang held their final council on the evening of September the 6th. Jesse was firm. The plan was set. They would enter the bank the following morning, take the cash, and be out of Northfield before the town understood what had happened. It had worked before in a dozen places. There was no reason it would not work here. They had been telling themselves this for 10 years. And on the morning of September the 7th, they rode into town. It's mid-morning and the light is flat and clear. 3 men sit on their horses at the end of Division Street, watching. 2 more position themselves near the bank entrance. 3 will go inside to manage the vault and the staff. The horses shift. One tosses his head against the rein. A hand moves to a saddlebag. Cartridges are checked. A revolver is opened, the cylinder turned and closed again. Coats are adjusted. The long dusters hang loose, covering what is underneath. The men do not speak much. What needs to be said has been said. Now there is only the waiting, and then the moving, and the clean space between decision and action that these men have lived inside for most of their adult lives. One of them glances up the street. A few townspeople move along the boardwalks. A wagon is parked outside a dry goods store. The morning is ordinary. It intends to stay that way. 3 men dismount in front of the bank. They push through the door. Inside, the First National Bank is quiet. The teller's cage, the wooden counter, the smell of paper and ink. There are 3 men behind the counter. Joseph Lee Hayward is the acting cashier, a bookkeeper filling in for his absent superior. He is a careful, soft-spoken man with no training for what is about to be asked of him. Jesse James is one of the 3 men who have come through the door. He draws his revolver. They order the staff to raise their hands. They order Hayward to open the vault. Hayward tells them it's on a time lock. He cannot open it. This is not true, but Hayward says it plainly, without theatre, and he does not move towards the vault. The men push harder. They move around the counter. One puts a knife to Hayward's throat. The demand is repeated. Open it. Open it now. Hayward does not open it. Outside, the street is beginning to change. One of the mounted men has started shouting, ordering people off the boardwalk, waving his revolver at anyone who hesitates. The calculation was that noise and speed would produce immediate compliance. Instead, it is producing the opposite. People are stopping. People are watching. A few are moving quickly, but not away. Moving towards doorways, moving towards buildings, moving with purpose. A merchant named Manning steps out from a hardware store across the street. He has a rifle. Above him, in the upper window of the Dampier Hotel, a young man settles the barrel of his rifle against the sill. The first shot comes from the street. One of the gang fires at a townsman who refuses to clear the boardwalk. The sound cracks off the brick storefront and rolls down the block. And then, it comes apart. Gunfire opens up from both sides of the street simultaneously. The gang, positioned in the open, takes fire from windows and doorways and rooftops. Many of them are veterans. They have held positions under fire before. Others, like the student in the hotel window, have no military training at all. But none of them break. They hold their ground and they keep firing, and the gang's horses are beginning to panic beneath them. Inside the bank, one of the gang moves towards the vault to check it. He realizes Hayward had been lying. The vault is not on a time lock. It's unlocked. Hayward lunges for the vault door and tries to slam it shut before the man can reach it. He is pulled back and thrown to the floor. One of the gang fires a shot past his head, close enough to mark the wall. A warning, or the beginning of something worse. A teller named Bunker breaks for the door. He is shot in the shoulder as he runs, but he makes it through out into the alley. He is alive. On Division Street, smoke is beginning to hang in the air. Two of the gang's horses are hit. Two of the gang members, Clell Miller and Bill Chadwell, take fire from the street. Miller is struck in the face and goes down from his horse. The student in the hotel window tracks Chadwell through the smoke and fires. Chadwell falls in the street. He does not get up. The men still mounted are firing in every direction. The noise is enormous. The brick buildings hold the sound and throw it back. Horses are screaming. A man shouts something from a doorway. The smoke moves slowly in the still morning air. The student in the hotel window reloads. The men inside the bank are running out of time and they know it. They got into the vault, but inside the vault sat a locked safe they could not open. Whatever cash lay loose on the counter has been swept up, but it's nothing. A handful, an insult measured against what this ride cost. One of them turns back to Hayward. There is a single shot. Hayward falls behind the counter and does not rise. The men come out of the bank at a run. The street is chaos. Smoke and shouting and the sound of horses on cobblestone. Two of the gang are already down. Another is slumped in the saddle, hit but riding. The men who were meant to hold the street have taken fire from three directions and the line they were holding is dissolved entirely. They ride. They push their horses hard off Division Street and out of Northfield at full gallop, leaving behind two of their own dead in the road. Behind them, the town is still firing. Shots follow them down the street and then fall short. The hoofbeats fade. The smoke begins to thin. On Division Street, a stillness returns that is not the same as the stillness before. It is the quiet of something having passed through. Two men from the gang lie dead in the dirt. A teller is bleeding but alive. And behind the counter of the First National Bank, Joseph Lee Hayward, the quiet man who would not open the vault, is dead. He held the line that cost him everything. The gang is gone, but they have left most of themselves behind. The roads ahead of them are unfamiliar and the countryside is already beginning to close in around them. They rode into Northfield as something feared. They ride out as something smaller. The countryside beyond Northfield did not offer what they needed. 6 men rode out of town that September afternoon. Cole Younger had been hit multiple times. His brother Bob had taken a round through the elbow that left his arm nearly useless. Jim Younger was shot through the jaw. Jesse and Frank were largely uninjured, which would matter in the days ahead. The gang had planned an escape through familiar logic, ride hard and fast, put distance between themselves and the town, and disappear into the landscape. It was how they had always moved. In Missouri it worked because they knew the roads and the roads knew them. In Minnesota, it worked for almost no one. The telegraph moved faster than horses. Within hours of the raid, word had spread across the region. Posses were forming in every direction. The flat, open countryside that had made the gang uneasy during their reconnaissance now worked fully against them. There was nowhere to fade into. Every farmhouse was a potential alarm. Every road led somewhere men were watching. They rode for 12 days through the rain-soaked countryside of southern Minnesota, hungry and increasingly desperate, their wounds stiffening and festering in the wet. Jesse pushed for speed. The younger brothers, slowed by their injuries, could not maintain it. Somewhere in those sodden miles, the gang made a decision that had probably been coming since Northfield. They split. Jesse and Frank rode west and eventually south, crossing into Dakota territory and disappearing back towards Missouri. They were hard men in good health, and they moved without hesitation. They would not be caught. The younger brothers and a man named Charlie Pitts stayed together. They were slower and they knew it. On September the 21st, near the town of Medelia, a posse of 7 men caught up with them in a thicket along the Wattawan River. The fight was brief and one-sided. Charlie Pitts was killed. Cole, Bob and Jim Younger were all captured, all of them wounded again, barely able to stand. Cole had been hit 11 times in total across the Northfield raid and the manhunt that followed. He surrendered with what witnesses described as quiet dignity, which was perhaps all that was left to him. The 3 brothers pleaded guilty to murder and were sentenced to life imprisonment at the Minnesota State Prison in Stillwater. They did not implicate Jesse or Frank. The code that had bound the gang together held even at the end, even when it could no longer protect anyone. The public reaction was complicated. It always had been with Jesse James. Some newspapers mourned the fracturing of an image they had helped construct. Others were more straightforward. Northfield had demonstrated something that the myth had obscured for years, that these men were not noble outlaws riding against an unjust system. They were former soldiers who had never found another way to live, and they had now run out of towns willing to be afraid of them. Jesse understood what Northfield meant. He did not say so publicly, but the years that followed were different from the ones before. He kept moving, he kept robbing, but the operations grew smaller and less disciplined. The men around him were no longer the hardened guerrillas of the old gang. They were newer, younger, less reliable. The James Younger gang as it had existed was gone. What replaced it was something lesser, a name more than a unit, running on reputation while the reputation slowly cashed out. The frontier that had given him room to move was closing. Railways and telegraph lines were threading through the spaces where men like Jesse had once been able to disappear. Law enforcement was better coordinated. The communities that had once sheltered him were wearier. The war that had made him was receding further into memory with each passing year, and with it, the sympathy of the men and women who had understood him as a product of that war. By 1882, he was living under an assumed name of Thomas Howard in a rented house in St. Joseph, Missouri. He was 34 years old. He had spent more than half his life outside the law. He had 2 children who knew him only as their father, a man who moved from house to house and kept a gun on his hip and never quite settled. The men around him were not men he fully trusted. He knew this. It is possible he had known it for some time and had simply stopped caring. April the 3rd, 1882, St. Joseph, Missouri. The house is quiet in the morning light. Robert Ford is already in the room when Jesse comes downstairs. He is 20 years old. He and his brother Charlie had been brought into Jesse's new, smaller gang as replacements for the men Northfield had taken. They are there that morning to plan the next robbery. Jesse knows this. It is enough reason to trust him, or close enough to trust that it no longer seems worth questioning. What Jesse does not know is that Ford had been meeting in secret with the governor of Missouri for weeks, negotiating a reward and a pardon in exchange for Jesse James, dead or alive. Jesse removes his gun belt and sets it aside. He had been careful about guns his whole life, in the particular way of men who have handled them since boyhood, and he does not like to wear one while doing ordinary things in an ordinary room. He notices a picture on the wall is crooked. He steps up onto a chair to straighten it. His back is turned. His gun is on the table. Ford stands up, raises his revolver to the back of Jesse's head, and he pulls the trigger. The house in St. Joseph fell quiet. A town in Minnesota had stood together. A legend fractured not all at once, but gradually, the way most things break. And the man inside the myth had been carried by it as far as it could carry him, into smaller rooms, smaller towns, and finally into the silence of an ordinary morning that he did not hear coming. The war that made him, it did not unmake him. That was left to time and distance, and a young man standing behind him in a room he thought was safe. Well then, there you have it. If you've listened this far and like what you've heard, consider liking and subscribing. Also hit that notification bell to be notified of future stories. I release a new one every Sunday. As a new channel, it helps so much, not only in pushing these stories in front of more of you lovely people, but also reassures me I'm not just sending these off into the ether, never to be seen again. If you've listened this far and don't like what you've heard, then what on earth are you doing? Right then, off you pop. Thanks for listening.